Chapter 4. Supplementary explanations by Engels. Marx gave the fundamentals concerning the significance of the experience of the commune. Engels returned to the same subject time and again and explained Marx's analysis and conclusions, sometimes elucidating other aspects of the question with power and vividness that it is necessary to deal with his explanations specially. Sorry. Eventually I get good at this a couple years down the line. Okay. The housing question. The housing question. 1872. Engels already took into account the experience of the commune and dealt several times with the tasks of the revolution in relation to the state. It is interesting to note that the treatment of this specific subject clearly revealed, on one hand, points of similarity between the proletarian state and the present state, points that warrant speaking of the state in both cases, and, on the other hand, points of difference between them, or how to transition to the destruction of the state. How is the housing question to be settled then? In present-day society, it is settled just as any other social question, by the gradual economic leveling of demand and supply, a settlement which reproduces the question itself again and again, and therefore is no settlement. How a social revolution would settle this question not only depends on the circumstances in each particular case, but is also connected with much more far-reaching questions, one of the most fundamental of which is the abolition of the antithesis between town and country. As it is not our task to create utopian systems for the organization of the future of society, it would be more than idle to go into the question here. But one thing is certain. There is already a sufficient quantity of houses in the big cities to remedy immediately all real housing shortage, provided they are used judiciously. This can naturally only occur through the expropriation of the present owners and by quartering in their houses homeless workers or workers overcrowded in their present homes. As soon as the proletariat has won political power, such a measure prompted by concern for the common good will be just as easy to carry out as are other expropriations and billetings by the present-day state. The change in the form of state power is not examined here, but only the content of its activity. Expropriations and billetings take place by order even of the present state. From the formal point of view, the proletarian state will also order the occupation of dwellings and expropriation of houses. But it is clear that the old executive apparatus, the bureaucracy, which is connected with the bourgeoisie, would simply be unfit to carry out the orders of the proletarian state. It must be pointed out that the actual seizure of all the instruments of labor, the taking possession of industry as a whole by the working people, is the exact opposite of the Proudhonist redemption. In the latter case, the individual worker becomes the owner of the dwelling. The peasant farm, the collective owners of the houses, factories, and instruments of labor, and will hardly permit their use, at least during a transitional period, by individuals or associations without compensation for the cost. In the same way, absolution of property in land is not the abolition of ground rent, but its transfer, if in a modified form, to society. The actual seizure of all the instruments of labor by the working people, therefore, does not at all preclude the retention of rent relations. We shall examine the question touched upon in this passage, namely the economic basis for the withering away of the state, in the next chapter. Engels expresses himself most cautiously, saying that the proletarian state would hardly permit the use of houses without payment, at least during a transitional period. The letting of houses owed by the whole people to individual families presupposes the collection of rent, a certain amount of control, and the employment of some standard in allotting the housing. All this calls for a certain form of state, but it does not all call for a special military bureaucratic apparatus with officials occupying especially privileged positions. The transition to a situation in which it will be possible to supply dwellings rent-free depends on the complete withering away of the state. Speaking of the blankest adoption of the fundamental position of Marxism after the Commune and under the influence of its experience, Engels, in passing, formulates this position as follows. Necessity of political action by the proletariat and of its dictatorship as the transition to the abolition of classes and, with them, of the state. Addicts of hair-splitting criticism or bourgeois exterminators of Marxism will perhaps see a contradiction between the recognition of the abolition of the state and repudiation of this formula as an anarchist, one in the above passage from Anti-Dueling. It would not be surprising if the opportunists classed Engels, too, as an anarchist, for it is becoming increasingly common with the social chauvinists to accuse the internationalists of anarchism. Marx has always taught that with the abolition of classes, the state will be abolished. The well-known passage of the withering away of the state in Anti-Düring accuses the anarchists not simply of favoring the abolition of the state, but of preaching that the state can be abolished overnight, as a now prevailing social democratic doctrine completely distorts the relation of Marxism to anarchism on the question of the abolition of the state. It will be particularly useful to recall a certain controversy in which Marx and Engels came out against the anarchists. So we've talked anarchists. So now, which I guess is technically part 2, controversy with the anarchists. This controversy took place in 1873. Marx and Engels contributed articles against the Proudhonists, autonomists, or anti-authoritarians to an Italian socialist annual, and it was not until 1913 that these articles appeared in German in Neue Zeit. If the political struggle of the working class assumes revolutionary form, wrote Marx, ridiculing the anarchists for their repudiation of politics, and if the workers set up their revolutionary dictatorship in the place of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, they commit the terrible crime of violating principles, for in order to satisfy their wretched, vulgar, everyday needs and to crush the resistance of the bourgeoisie, they give the state a revolutionary and transient form instead of laying down their arms and abolishing the state. It was solely against this kind of abolition of the state that Marx fought in refuting the anarchists. He did not at all oppose the view that the state would disappear when classes disappear, or that it would be abolished when classes were abolished. What he did oppose was the proposition that the workers should renounce the use of arms, organized violence, that is, the state, which is to serve to crush the resistance of the bourgeoisie. To prevent the true meaning of his struggle against anarchism from being distorted, Marx expressly emphasized the revolutionary and transient form of the state which the proletariat needs. The proletariat needs the state only temporarily. We do not, after all, differ with the anarchists on the question of the abolition of the state as the aim. We maintain that, to achieve this aim, we must temporarily make the use of the instruments, resources, and methods of the state power against the exploiters, just as the temporary dictatorship of the oppressed class is necessary for the abolition of classes. Marx uses the sharpest and clearest way of stating his case against the anarchists. After overthrowing the yoke of the capitalists, should the workers lay down their arms or use them against the capitalists in order to crush their resistance? But what is the systematic use of arms by one class against another, if not a transient form of state? Let every social democrat ask himself, is that how he has been posing the question of the state in controversy with the anarchists? Is that how it has been posed by the vast majority of the official socialist parties of the Second International? Engels expounds the same ideas in much greater detail and still more popularly. First of all, he ridicules the muddled ideas of the Proudhonists, who called themselves anti-authoritarians, i.e., repudiated all authority, all subordination, all power. Take a factory, a railway, a ship on the high seas, said Engels. It is not clear that not one of these complex technical establishments, based on the use of machinery and the systematic cooperation of many people, could function without a certain amount of subordination and consequently without a certain amount of authority or power? When I counter the most rabid anti-authoritarians with these arguments, the only answer they can give me is the following. Oh, that's true, except that here it is not a question of authority which we vest our delegates, but of a commission. These people imagine they can change a thing by changing its name. Having thus shown that authority and autonomy are relative terms, that the sphere of their application varies with the various phases of social development, that it is absurd to take them as absolutes, and adding that the sphere of application of machinery and large-scale production is steadily expanding, Engels passes from the general discussion of authority to the question of the state. Had the autonomists, he wrote, contented themselves with saying that the social organization of the future would allow authority only within the bounds of which the conditions of production made inevitable, one could have come to terms with them. But they are all blind to the facts that make authority necessary, and they passionately fight the word. Why do the anti-authoritarians not confine themselves to crying out against political authority, the state? All socialists are agreed that the state, and with it political authority, will disappear as a result of the coming social revolution. That is, the public functions will lose their political character and become more mere administrative functions of watching over social interests. But the anti-authoritarians demand that the political state be abolished at one stroke, even before the social relations that gave both to it have been destroyed. They demand that the first act of the social revolution shall be the abolition of authority. Have these gentlemen ever seen a revolution? A revolution is certainly the most authoritarian. Yeah, this is a very famous quote. A revolution is certainly the most authoritarian thing there is, an act whereby one part of the population imposes will on the other part by means of rifles, bayonets, and cannon, all of which are highly authoritarian means. And the victorious party must maintain its rule by means of the terror which its aims inspire in the reactionaries. Would the Paris Commune have lasted more than a day if it had not used the authority of the armed people against the bourgeoisie? Cannot we, on the contrary, blame it for having made too little use of that authority? Therefore, one of two things. Either that anti-authoritarians don't know what they're talking about, in which case they are creating nothing but confusion, or they do know, and in that case they are betraying the cause of the proletariat. In either case, they only serve reaction. They serve only reaction. This argument touches upon questions which should be examined in connection with the relationship between politics and economics during the withering away of the state. These questions are the transformation of public functions from political into simple functions of administration, and the political state. The last term, one particularly liable to misunderstanding, indicates the process of the withering away of the state. At a certain stage of this process, the state, which is withering away, may be called upon in a non-political state. Against the most remarkable thing in this argument of Engels is the way he states his case against the anarchists. Social Democrats, claiming to be disciples of Engels, have argued on this subject against the anarchists millions of times since 1873, but they have not argued as Marxists could and should. The anarchist idea of abolition of the state is muddled and non-revolutionary. That is how Engels puts it. It is precisely the revolution in its rise and development with its specific tasks in relation to violence, authority, power, and the state that the anarchists refuse to see. The usual criticism of anarchism by present-day social democrats has been boiled down to the purest Philistine banality. We recognize the state, whereas the anarchists do not. Naturally, such banality cannot but repel workers who are at all capable of thinking and revolutionary-minded. What Engels says is different. He stresses that all socialists recognize that the state will disappear as a result of the socialist revolution. He then deals specifically with the question of the revolution, the very question which, as a rule, the Social Democrats evade out of the opportunism, leaving it, so to speak, exclusively for the anarchists to work out. And when dealing with this question, Engels takes the bull by the horns. He asks, should not the commune have made more use of the revolutionary power of the state, that is, of the proletariat armed and organized as the ruling class? Prevailing official social democracy usually dismissed the question of the concrete tasks of the proletariat in the revolution either with a Philistine sneer or at best with a sophistic evasion. The future will show, and the anarchists were justified in saying about such social democrats that they were failing in their task of giving the workers a revolutionary education. Engels draws upon the experience of the last proletarian revolution precisely for the purpose of making a most concrete study of what should be done by the proletariat and in what manner in relation to both the banks and the state. Letter to Bebel. One of the most, if not the most, remarkable observations on the state in the works of Marx and Engels is contained in the following passage in Engels' letter to Bebel, dated March 18th to 28th, 1875. This letter, we may observe in parentheses, was, as far as we know, first published by Bebel in the second volume of his memoirs, which appeared in 1911, i.e., 36 years after the letter had been written and sent. Engels wrote to Bebel, criticizing the same draft of the Gotha program, which Marx criticized in his famous letter to Bracha, referring specifically to the question of the state. Engels said, "The free peoples of the state have been transferred into the free state. Taken in its grammatical sense, a free state is one where the state is free in relation to its citizens, hence a state with a despotic government. The whole talk about the state should be dropped, especially since the commune, which is no longer a state in the proper sense of the word. The people's state has been thrown in our faces by the anarchists to the point of disgust, although already Marx's book against Proudhon and later the Communist Manifesto say plainly that with the introduction of the socialist order of society, the state dissolves of itself and disappears, as the state is only a transitional institution which is used in the struggle in the revolution to hold down one's adversaries by force. It is sheer nonsense to talk of free people's state. So long as the proletariat still needs a state, it does not need it in the interests of freedom, but in order to hold down its adversaries. And as soon as it becomes possible to speak of freedom, the state as such ceases to exist. We would therefore propose replacing the state everywhere by Gemeinwesen, a good old German word which can very well take the place of the French word commune. It has been borne in mind that this letter refers to the party program which Marx criticized in a letter dated only a few weeks later than the above. Marx's letter is dated May 5th, 1875, and that at the same time, Engels was living with Marx in London. Consequently, when he says "we" in the last sentence, Engels undoubtedly in his own as well as in Marx's name, suggests to the leader of the German Workers' Party that the word state be struck out of the program and replaced with the word community, What a howl about anarchism would be raised by the leading lights of present-day Marxism, which has been falsified for the convenience of the opportunists, if such an amendment of the program were suggested to them. Let them howl. This will earn them the praises of the bourgeoisie, and we shall go on with our work. In revising the program of our party, we must by all means take the advice of Engels and Marx into consideration in order to come nearer to the truth, to restore Marxism by ridding it of distortions. Oh, that's why. Okay. Sorry. To guide the struggle of the working class for its emancipation more correctly. Certainly, no one opposed to the advice of Engels and Marx will be found among the Bolsheviks. The only difficulty that may perhaps arise will be in regard to the term. In German, there are two words meaning community, of which Engels is used the one which does not denote a single community, but their totality, a system of communities. In Russian, there is no such word, as we may have to choose the French word commune, although this also has its drawbacks. You know what? Let me put a nice little background here. Let me see if I can do that right quick. Let me put a nice little background here. Let's see here. I already used that one. I'm going to use this one. Of course. Huh. Well, that's lovely, isn't it? That's a bit of lovely, isn't it? Okay. Well, let me see here. Well, let me see if I can share screen. Share that. There we go. There we go. Got it. Hide. Let me see here. Maybe I could just type up. Let me see here. I just suddenly decided to do this. Sorry, folks. Let me do this right quick here. Boop. Boop, boop. And we'll go ahead and use this one right quick here. Here we go. We'll go ahead and do this. Go ahead and mute that there. There we go. That's a good one. Why don't we keep it on that for a little bit? There we go. Let's go ahead and... I was going to try to do a picture. Let me see if I can do that. I'm just messing around with stuff as I shouldn't do. You know what? I'll just go back to what I was. I'll just go back to this. Okay, let's carry on. The commune was no longer a state in the proper sense of the word. This is the most theoretically important statement Engels ever makes. After what has been said above, the statement is perfectly clear. The commune was ceasing to be a state since it had to suppress not the majority of the population, but a minority, the exploiters. It had smashed the bourgeois state machine. In place of a special coercive force, the population itself came on the scene. All this was a departure from the state in the proper sense of the word. And had the commune been first become firmly established, all traces of the state in it would have withered away of themselves. It would not have had to abolish the institutions of the state. They would have ceased to function as they ceased to have anything to do. The people's state has been thrown in our faces by the anarchists in saying this. Engels above all, has in mind Bakunin and his attacks on the German Social Democrats. Engels admits that these attacks were justified insofar as the People's State was as much an absurdity and as much a departure from socialism as the Free People's State. Engels tried to put the struggle of the German Social Democrats against the anarchists on the right lines to make the struggle correct in principle, to write it out of opportunist prejudices concerning the state. Unfortunately, Engels' letter was pigeonholed for 36 years. We shall see farther on that even after this letter was published, Kautsky persisted in virtually the same mistakes against which Engels had warned. Bebel replied to Engels' letter in a letter dated September 21st, 1875, in which he wrote, among other things, that he fully agreed with Engels' opinion of the draft program and that he had reproached Liebknecht with readiness to make concessions. But if we take Bebel's pamphlet, Our Aims, we find that there are views on the state there that are absolutely wrong. The state must be transformed from one based on class rule into a people's state. This was printed in the ninth edition of Bebel's pamphlet. It is not surprising that the opportunist views on the state, so persistently repeated, were absorbed by the German Social Democrats, especially as Engels' revolutionary interpretations had been safely pigeonholed, and all conditions of life were such as to wean them from revolution for a long time. 2. Criticism of the draft of the Erfurt Program. In analyzing Marxist teachings of the state, the criticism of the draft of the Erfurt Program sent by Engels to Kautsky on June 29, 1891, and published only 10 years later in Neue Zeit, cannot be ignored, for it is with the opportunist views of the Social Democrats on questions of state organization that this criticism is mainly concerned. We shall note in passing that Engels also makes an exceedingly valuable observation on economic questions, which shows how attentively and thoughtfully he had watched the various changes occurring in modern capitalism, and how for this reason he was able to foresee, to a certain extent, the tasks of our present, the imperialist epoch. Here is that observation referring to the word planlessness, used in the draft program as characteristic of capitalism. Engels wrote, "When we pass from joint stock companies to trusts, which assume control over and monopolize whole industries, it is not only private production that ceases, but also planlessness. Here we have what is most essential in the theoretical appraisal of the latest phase of communism, i.e., imperialism, namely that capitalism becomes monopoly capitalism. The latter must be emphasized because the erroneous bourgeois reformist assertion that monopoly capitalism or state monopoly capitalism is no longer capitalism, but can now be called state socialism, and so on, is very common. The trusts, of course, never provided, do not now provide, and cannot provide complete planning. But however much they do plan, however much the capitalist magnates calculate in advance the volume of production on a national and even an international scale, and however much they systematically regulate it, we still remain under capitalism at its new stage. It is true, but still capitalism, without a doubt. The proximity of such capitalism to socialism should serve genuine representatives of the proletariat as an argument proving the proximity, facility, feasibility, and urgency of the socialist revolution, and not at all as an argument for tolerating the repudiation of such a revolution and the efforts to make capitalism look more attractive, something which all reformers are trying to do. But to return to the question of the state, in his letter, Engels makes three particularly valuable suggestions. First, in regard to the Republic. Second, regard to the connection between the national question and state organization. And third, in regard to local self-government. In regard to the Republic, Engels made this focal point of this criticism of the draft of the Erfurt program. And when we recall the importance which the Erfurt program acquired for all the social democrats of the world, and that it became the model for the whole Second International, we may say without exaggeration that Engels thereby criticizes the opportunism of the whole Second International. The political demands of the draft, Engels wrote, have one great fault. It lacks precisely what should have been said. And later on, he makes it clear that the German Constitution is, strictly speaking, a copy of the extremely reactionary Constitution of 1850, that the Reichstag is only, as Wilhelm Liebknecht put it, the fig leaf of absolutism, and that to wish to transform all the instruments of labor into common property on the basis of a constitution which legalizes the existence of petty states and the federation of petty German states is an obvious absurdity. To touch on that is dangerous, however. Engels added, knowing only too well that it was impossible legally to include in the program the demand for a republic in Germany. But he refused to merely accept this obvious consideration which satisfied everybody. He continued, nevertheless, somehow or other, the thing has to be attacked. How necessary this is shown precisely at the present time by opportunism, which is gaining ground in a large section of the social democratic press. Fearing a renewal of the anti-socialist law, or recalling all manner of over-hasty pronouncements made during the reign of that law, they now want the party to find the present legal order in Germany adequate for putting through all party demands by peaceful means. Engels particularly stressed the fundamental fact that the German Social Democrats were prompted by fear of a renewal of the anti-socialist law and explicitly described it as opportunism. He declared that precisely because there was no republic and no freedom in Germany, the dreams of a peaceful path were perfectly absurd. Engels was careful not to tie his hands was careful not to tie his hands. He admitted that in republican or very free countries one can only conceive of a peaceful development towards socialism, but in Germany, he repeated, in Germany, where the government is almost omnipotent, and the Reichstag and all other representative bodies have no real power to advocate such a thing in Germany, where, moreover, there is no need to do so, means removing the fig leaf of absolutism and becoming oneself a screen for its nakedness. The great majority of the official leaders of the German Social Democratic Party, which pigeonholed this advice, has really proved to be a screen for absolutism. In the long run, such a policy can only lead one's own party astray. They push general, abstract political questions into the foreground, thereby concealing the immediate, concrete questions, which at the moment of the first great events, the first political crisis, automatically pose themselves. What can result from this except that at the decisive moment the party suddenly proves helpless, and that uncertainty and discord on the most decisive issues reign in it because these issues have never been discussed? This forgetting of the great principal considerations for the momentary interest of the day, this struggling and striving for the success of the moment regards of later consequences, this sacrifice of the future of the movement for its present may be honestly meant. But it is and remains opportunism, and honest opportunism is perhaps the most dangerous of all. If one thing is certain, it is that our party and the working class can only come to power in the form of the democratic republic. This is even the specific form for the dictatorship of the proletariat, as the great French Revolution has already shown. Engels realized here in a particularly striking form the fundamental idea which runs through all of Marx's works, namely that the democratic republic is the nearest approach to the dictatorship of the proletariat. For such a republic, without in the least abolishing the rule of capital, and therefore the expression of the masses and the class struggle, inevitably leads to such an extension, development, unfolding, and intensification of this struggle that, as soon as it becomes possible to meet the fundamental interests of the oppressed masses, this possibility is realized inevitably and solely through the dictatorship of the proletariat. Thus, the leadership of those masses by the proletariat. These two are forgotten words of Marxism for the whole of the Second International, and the fact that they have been forgotten was demonstrated with particular vividness by the history of the Menshevik Party during the first 6 months of the Russian Revolution of 1917. On the subject of a federal republic, in connection with the national composition of the population, Engels wrote, "What should take the place of the present-day Germany with its reactionary monarchical constitution and its equally reactionary division into petty states, a division which perpetuates all the specific features of Prussianism, instead of dissolving them in Germany as a whole? In my view, the proletariat can only use the form of the one and indivisible republic, a gigantic territory of the United States. A federal republic is still, on the whole, a necessity. Although in the eastern states it is already becoming a hindrance, it will be a step forward in Britain, where the two islands and peoples by 4 nations, and in spite of a single parliament, 3 different systems of legislation already exist side by side. In little Switzerland, it has long been a hindrance, tolerable only because Switzerland is content to be a purely passive member of the European state system. For Germany, federalization on the Swiss model would be an enormous step backward. 2 points distinguish a union state from a completely unified state. First, that each member state, each canton, has its own civil and criminal, legislative, and judicial system, and second, that alongside a popular chamber, there is also a federal chamber in which each canton, whether large or small, votes as such. In Germany, the Union state is the transition to the completely unified state, and the revolution from above of 1866 and 1870 must not be reversed, but supplemented by a movement from below. Far from being indifferent to the forms of state, Engels, on the contrary, tried to analyze the transitional forms with the utmost thoroughness in order to establish, in accordance with the concrete historical peculiarities of each particular case, from what and to what the given transitional form is passing. Approaching the matter from the standpoint of the proletariat and the proletarian revolution, Engels, like Marx, upheld the democratic centralism as the republic one and indivisible. He regarded the federal republic either as an exception and a hindrance to the development, or as a transition from a monarchy to a centralized republic, as a step forward under certain social conditions, and among these special conditions he put the national question to the foray. Although mercilessly criticizing the reactionary nature of small states and the screening of this by the national question in certain concrete cases, Engels, like Marx, never betrayed the slightest desire to brush aside the national question, a desire of which the Dutch and Polish Marxists, who proceed from their perfectly justified opposition to the narrow Philistine nationalism of their little states, are often guilty. Even in regard to Britain, where geographical conditions, a common language, and the history of many centuries would seem to have put an end to the national question, in the various small divisions of the country, even in regard to that country, Engels reckoned with the plain fact that the national question was not yet a thing of the past, and recognized in consequence that the establishment of a federal republic would be a step forward. Of course, there is not the slightest hint here of Engels abandoning the criticism of the shortcomings of a federal republic, or renouncing the most determined advocacy of and struggle for a unified and centralized democratic republic. But Engels did not at all mean democratic centralism in the bureaucratic sense, in which the term is used by bourgeois and petty bourgeois ideologists, the anarchists among the latter. His idea of centralism did not in the least preclude such broad local self-government as would combine the voluntary defense of the unity of the state by the communes and districts and the complete elimination of all bureaucratic practices and all ordering from above. Carrying forward the program views of Marxism on the state, Engels wrote, So then, a unified republic, but not in the sense of the present French Republic, which is nothing but the empire established in 1798 without the emperor, from 1792 to 1798. Each French department, each commune, enjoyed complete self-government on the American model. And this is what we too must have. How self-government is to be organized and how we can manage without a bureaucracy has been shown to us by America and the First French Republic, and is being shown even today by Australia, Canada, and other English colonies, and a provincial, regional, and communal self-government of this type is far freer than, for instance, Swiss federalism, under which it is true the canton is very independent in relation to the Bund, but is also independent in relation to the district and the commune. The cantonal governments appoint the district governors and prefects, which is unknown in English-speaking countries and which we want to abolish here as resolutely in the future as the Prussian Landrat and Legierungslata. Okay. Accordingly, Engels proposes the following words for the self-government clause in the program: complete self-government for the provinces, districts, and communes through officials elected by universal suffrage. The abolition of all local and provincial authorities appointed by the state. I have already had occasion to point out in Pravda, which was suppressed by the government of Kerensky and other socialist ministers, on how this point, of course, not on this point alone by any means, our pseudo-socialist representatives of pseudo-revolutionary pseudo-democracy have made glaring departures from democracy. Naturally, the people who have bound themselves by a coalition to the imperialist bourgeoisie have remained deaf to this criticism. It is extremely important to note that Engels, armed with facts, disproved by a most precise example the prejudice, which is very widespread, particularly among petty bourgeois Democrats, that a federal republic necessarily means a greater amount of freedom than a centralized republic. This is wrong. It is disproved by the facts cited by Engels regarding the centralized French Republic of 1792 to 98 and the federal Swiss Republic. The really democratic centralized republic gave more freedom than that of the federal republic. In other words, the greatest amount of local, regional, and other freedom known in history was accorded by a centralized and not a federal republic. Insufficient attention has been and is being paid in our party propaganda and agitation to this fact, as indeed to the whole question of the federal and the centralized republic and local self-government. Okay, we're going to go ahead and end it there. I appreciate that one guy sticking through, whoever that may be. Tomorrow we're going to continue on with talking about the 1891 preface to Marx's The Civil War in France, and then continuing on with Chapter 5, which, of course, for those that know, has the famous quote of, "We shall destroy the military and police into atoms." So stick around for that tomorrow, around the same time. I hope y'all enjoyed, and y'all have a good night. See you later.